The dust of the high desert was a fine, pale powder that settled on everything, a shroud for the forgotten. It coated the warped planks of Gideon Marsh's trading post, filled the cracks in his leathered hands, and clung to the coat of the small chestnut mare who stood, head bowed, in the corner of the corral. Her name was Ember, though no one used it much. She was just the little one, the nervous one, an afterthought in a world that valued size and stability. The sun beat down with a flat, indifferent heat, bleaching the sky to a washed-out blue and baking the very hope out of the air. Around her, the other horses, Thunder and Rocky, stood like twin pillars of granite, their broad chests and powerful haunches a testament to reliable strength. They were the kind of horses men came for, horses that could pull a wagon from a muddy ditch or carry a rider for 50 miles without complaint. Men would walk up to the fence, hook their boot heels on the lowest rail, and nod toward the big geldings. "That's good stock, Gideon," they'd say, their voices a low rumble of approval. Their eyes would scan right past Ember as if she were a shadow, a trick of the light. Ember felt their dismissal as a physical weight. Her skin twitched, not from flies, but from the familiar sting of being judged and found wanting. She was small, her frame more suited to a deer than a working horse, and her chestnut coat, while clean, lacked the deep, impressive gloss of her corral mates. But it was her fear that truly condemned her. It lived in her, a constant low-frequency hum, a sudden movement, a loud voice, the snap of a whip in the distance. Any of it could send a tremor through her delicate legs. It was a trembling she couldn't control, a visible manifestation of the skittish heart that beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She would flinch, her eyes widening, her breath catching in a little snort of panic, and the men would turn away, their interest evaporating. "Too spooky," they'd mutter, and the word was a brand. Gideon never argued. He'd just give a curt nod, his weathered face unreadable. He'd won her in a poker game from a rancher who was glad to be rid of her, and for months she had been a fixture of silent rejection at the edge of his property. She was an item in his inventory that wouldn't move, a constant, quiet reminder of a bad bet. Her world was a small loop of anxiety. The dusty corral, the cool darkness of the stable, the metallic taste of water in the trough, and the ever-present weight of being unwanted. She watched the other horses, Thunder and Rocky, with a kind of bewildered awe. They moved with a placid certainty, their hooves planting firmly on the earth as if they owned it. They accepted the saddle without a flinch, chewed their oats with a steady, grinding rhythm, and met the eyes of humans with a calm indifference that Ember could only dream of. Her own interactions were fraught with nervous energy. When Gideon came to fill her feed bucket, she would press herself into the far corner, her body a taut line of apprehension, until he stepped back. He was never cruel, his movements slow and deliberate, but the gulf between them was vast, a canyon of instinct and fear. He was a predator, and she was prey, and no amount of routine could fully erase that primal truth from her blood. She craved the safety of a herd she did not have, the reassuring presence of a lead mare she had never known. Here she was an island, and the sea of her fear threatened always to overwhelm her. On this particular morning, the heat was already oppressive by the time the sun had cleared the jagged peaks to the east. A group of ranchers, including a man named Tobias Ward, had stopped by, their conversation a low murmur of cattle prices and the ever-present threat of drought. Ember stood in her usual spot, half hidden by the shadow of the water trough, trying to make herself smaller, to fade into the texture of the wooden fence behind her. She watched as Tobias ran a hand down Rocky's powerful back. "He's a fine animal, Gideon, a real beast." "He'll do the work," Gideon replied, his voice dry as the dust at their feet. Tobias's gaze drifted for a moment and fell upon Ember. It wasn't a look of consideration, but of idle curiosity, the way a man might glance at a tumbleweed. "What's her story?" Gideon's shoulders gave a barely perceptible shrug. "Poker winnings. More trouble than she's worth, I reckon. Good bloodline, they say. But she's got a fear of her own shadow." The men chuckled, a sound that made Ember's ears pivot and her muscles tense. She dropped her head lower, the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight before her nose becoming the most interesting thing in the world. Rejection was a familiar ache, a dull pressure behind her eyes. She was a flawed thing, a broken tool in a world that demanded perfection. Her heart, which she knew was strong, she could feel it beating, a powerful drum in the hollow of her chest, was trapped inside a body that betrayed her with every tremble. She possessed a strange, keen awareness of the world, a sensitivity that the other horses seemed to lack. She could smell a storm on the wind hours before the clouds gathered, could feel the subtle shift in the earth that signaled a far-off rockslide. But these instincts were useless, twisted and misinterpreted as simple, worthless fear. She was overlooked, a ghost in her own life, and the hopelessness of it was a vast, empty landscape stretching out before her. The lazy rhythm of the morning was shattered by the sound of an engine revving too high, followed by the frantic slam of a truck door. A cloud of dust billowed into the corral as a battered Ford pickup skidded to a halt near the trading post. The ranchers turned, their conversation cut short. Gideon straightened from his lean against the fence post, his eyes narrowed. A woman stumbled out of the truck, her face a mask of pure panic. It was Clara Ward, Tobias's wife. Her dress was rumpled, her hair had come loose from its bun, and her eyes were wide with a terror that silenced the world. "She's gone," Clara gasped, her voice thin and ragged. "Sadie, she's gone." Tobias was at her side in an instant, his hands on her shoulders. "What are you talking about, Clara? Gone where?" "I don't know," she cried, a sob tearing through the words. "I went to wake her this morning. Her bed was empty. The back door was open. I thought she was just playing in the yard, but she's not there, Tobias. I've called and called. She's gone." The casual morning atmosphere curdled into dread. Sadie, their daughter, a small, bright girl of 8 with a wild imagination and a love for exploring the creek bed behind their homestead. The creek bed that snaked its way into the labyrinth of canyons and ravines that clawed at the edges of their small pocket of civilization. A silence fell over the men, heavy and absolute. They all knew that landscape. It was a place of deceptive beauty and sudden, brutal danger. It was a maze of sun-baked rock, thorny brush, and hidden drop-offs. A place where a child could get turned around in minutes and vanish completely in an hour. The dread in the air was a scent Ember could taste, sharp and metallic like blood. It was a human emotion, but its frequency was one she understood perfectly. The terror of the lost, the fear of the predator. She lifted her head, her nostrils flaring, catching the scent of Clara Ward's desperation on the hot, dry wind. It was a scent that resonated with the fear she lived with every single day. Immediately, the lazy group of ranchers transformed into a grimly efficient unit. Voices became clipped, purposeful. "I'll get the boys from my place," one said, already turning toward his horse. "We'll start at the creek and spread out." "I'll ride west, toward the broken spire," another offered. Tobias, his face pale and strained, nodded, trying to impose order on the chaos of his own fear. "Split into pairs. Cover the low ground first. Fire a shot if you find anything. Anything at all." He looked at Gideon, his eyes pleading. "Gideon, your horses, they're the best in the county." Gideon didn't hesitate. "They're yours. Take them." He moved toward the stable to get the saddles for Thunder and Rocky, his movements economical and swift. The world had narrowed to a single, terrible point of focus. A lost child. As the men rushed to prepare, their voices a low, urgent hum, a palpable sense of dread began to settle over the trading post. The wilderness they were about to enter was not a passive stage. It was an active antagonist. Its sheer scale was overwhelming. Miles upon miles of twisted canyons, sharp ravines, and acres of loose rock where a single misstep could mean disaster. The sun, which had been a source of simple heat, now felt malevolent, a searing eye that would dehydrate and disorient. And somewhere, in that vast, dangerous expanse, was a little girl. Gideon worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced ease as he cinched the saddle on Thunder. Tobias was already throwing a bridle over Rocky's head, his movements jerky with anxiety. The other men were mounting up, their faces set in grim lines. Ember watched them from her corner, a forgotten detail in the unfolding drama. She was too small, too unreliable. Of course, she would be left behind. It was the natural order of things. She felt the familiar pang of rejection, but it was overshadowed by a new, strange feeling, a humming anxiety that was not her own. It was a reflection of the collective fear of the humans, but it was also something else, something deeper. An instinct, sharp and insistent, was beginning to prickle at the edges of her awareness. It was a pull, a direction, a faint scent on the wind that only she seemed to notice. As the last of the search party prepared to ride out, Gideon paused. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his gaze sweeping over the frenetic activity. And then, his eyes landed on Ember. She stood alone, her head up now, her ears pricked forward, her gaze fixed not on the men, but on the distant, hazy line of the canyons to the north. She was trembling, but it was different this time. It wasn't the spastic shiver of pure panic. It was a finer tremor, a vibration of intense, focused energy, as if she were a compass needle that had just found its pole. The other ranchers would have called him a fool. His own pragmatic mind told him it was a waste of time. The horse was a liability, a spook waiting for a reason to bolt. Taking her into that treacherous country was inviting disaster. But Gideon Marsh had survived in the high desert for 40 years by trusting something deeper than logic. He called it intuition. His late wife had called it stubbornness. It was a quiet voice he'd learned not to ignore. He saw the other horses, strong and ready, focused only on the riders on their backs. And he saw Ember, the outcast, focused on the wilderness itself. Something in her posture, in the unwavering direction of her gaze, made a decision for him. Against all reason, against the silent, questioning looks of the other men, he walked into the corral, grabbed a bridle, and approached the chestnut mare. "All right, little one," he murmured, his voice softer than she was used to. "Looks like it's your turn to earn your keep." Ember flinched as he drew near, her old fears rising like bile. But the other feeling, the insistent pull from the north, was stronger. When his hand touched her neck, she trembled, but did not bolt. As he slipped the bit into her mouth, a cold, foreign metal, she accepted it. And when he threw the light saddle over her back, she stood still, her muscles quivering but holding. She was a vessel of conflict, her ingrained terror at war with a powerful, inexplicable instinct. Gideon swung himself up, his weight settling onto her back. It felt strange, unfamiliar. She was not used to this. But as he took the reins, he didn't immediately turn her to follow the others. He let her stand there for a moment, and he felt it too, the fine, high-frequency trembling that vibrated up through the saddle. She was looking north, toward the jagged maw of Coyote Canyon, and her entire being was thrumming with a singular, urgent purpose. Gideon looked at the anxious faces of the search party, then back at the endless, dangerous landscape. Acting on a sliver of intuition that felt as thin and sharp as a shard of glass, he nudged Ember forward, not toward the well-trodden path the others were taking, but in the direction she was already facing, into the heart of the unforgiving wild. The sun climbed higher, a merciless brass disk in the vast, empty sky. The heat radiated up from the baked earth in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon and making the distant mesas tremble. The search party had fanned out, their figures shrinking into the immense landscape, becoming small, desperate specks against the ochre and umber rock. Gideon rode alone with Ember, a silent pact of uncertainty between them. He had let her have her head, and she had moved with a purpose that belied her nervous reputation. It wasn't a reckless gallop, but a steady, ground-eating trot, her small hooves picking a careful path through the scree and thorny scrub. He could feel the tension in her, a coiled spring of focused energy, but the frantic, skittish fear was gone, replaced by something else. Determination. The other ranchers had followed the logic of the creek bed, the most likely path a child would take. It was a sound strategy, the one Gideon himself would have chosen on any other day, with any other horse. But Ember was pulling him steadily north, away from the creek, toward a brutal-looking tangle of canyons that the locals actively avoided. It was a place of blind alleys, sudden drops, and rocks that shifted underfoot without warning. A place where a man could get lost, let alone a child. Every instinct honed by years of pragmatism screamed at Gideon to turn back, to rejoin the main search. This was a fool's errand, chasing the whim of a spooky mare. He could hear the imagined mockery of the other men. Old Gideon's finally lost it, following that little scrap of a horse into the devil's own backyard. Yet, he stayed his hand. He felt the unwavering pull through the reins, the way Ember's body was a taut arrow aimed at a single, unseen target. He had seen fear in horses 1,000 times. This was not it. This was something else entirely, a primal certainty that radiated from her. He loosened his grip, surrendering to the mare's strange wisdom. They were a solitary pair, a weathered man and a nervous horse, moving against all logic, guided by an instinct he couldn't name but was beginning to trust more than his own eyes. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of Ember's hooves on the dry, gravelly soil, and the low sigh of the hot wind moving through the sparse, skeletal creosote bushes. The landscape grew more hostile, the ground falling away into a series of jagged, descending ledges. They were entering the maze. Hours passed. The sun beat down, and Gideon's canteen was already half empty. The hope that had spurred the initial frantic search was beginning to fray, worn thin by the vastness of the wilderness and the suffocating heat. Dread was a cold stone in his stomach. A child couldn't survive long out here. Every shadow looked like a small, huddled shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a faint cry. His mind played tricks on him, his hope and his fear tangling together until he could no longer trust what he saw. He was on the verge of turning back, of admitting this strange impulse had been a mistake, when Ember stopped. She halted so abruptly he was nearly thrown forward in the saddle. She stood stock still, her head raised, her ears swiveling like sensitive antennae. Her nostrils flared, tasting the air. She took a step, then another, her movements slow and deliberate now, as if she were tracking something by a scent too faint for any other creature to perceive. She led him around a massive sandstone hoodoo that stood like a silent red sentinel, and there, the ground simply vanished. Before them was a ravine, a deep, narrow gash in the earth that hadn't been visible until they were right upon it. It was perhaps 50 feet deep, its walls a treacherous near-vertical mix of crumbling rock and compacted dirt. It was a death trap, a place from which there could be no easy escape. Ember walked to the very edge, her small hooves inches from the precipice, and peered down. Gideon dismounted, his heart pounding against his ribs, a sickening premonition washing over him. He crept to the edge beside her, his hand resting on her tense, trembling neck, and looked down. At first he saw nothing but shadows and scree. Then, a flicker of color, a small patch of blue fabric, stark against the brown earth. And then, he saw her. Sadie. She was lying at the bottom of the ravine, huddled against the far wall. One of her legs was bent at an unnatural angle, and her face was pale, streaked with dirt and tears. She was conscious, her small chest rising and falling, but she was trapped. A wave of desperate relief and profound horror washed over Gideon. They had found her. She was alive. But the sight was devastating. The ravine was too steep and narrow to lead a horse down, and climbing it without proper gear would be suicidal for a man, let alone for one trying to carry an injured child. He was miles from the others, in a place no one would think to look. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "Sadie!" he called, his voice echoing strangely off the canyon walls. "Sadie, can you hear me?" The small head lifted, her eyes widened, a flicker of hope in their frightened depths. "Mr. Marsh?" Her voice was a tiny, weak whisper, barely audible over the wind. "We're here, child. We're going to get you out," he shouted, forcing a confidence he did not feel. He looked at Ember, who stood beside him, her gaze still fixed on the girl below. The horse hadn't taken her eyes off Sadie for a second. The trembling had returned to her body, a low-level vibration, but her stance was unwavering. This was it. This was the target she had been leading him to all along. The revelation struck Gideon with the force of a physical blow. The mare hadn't been running from something. She had been running to something. Her fear, that constant defining trait, was secondary to a powerful, unexplainable instinct that had guided her across miles of hostile terrain with unerring accuracy. His mind raced, calculating impossible options. He could try to ride for help, but it would take hours. Hours Sadie might not have. The sun was beginning to dip toward the western mesas, and the sky, which had been a clear, relentless blue, was now showing bruises of purple and gray along the horizon. A subtle shift in the air pressure told his experienced senses what was coming. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the distant metallic scent of rain. A storm was brewing, a high desert storm, the kind that could turn a dry wash into a raging torrent, and a narrow ravine into a watery grave in minutes. The hope that had flared so brightly upon finding her was now flickering, threatened by the impossible reality of their situation. Sadie was found, but she was no less lost. She was trapped in an inaccessible cage of rock, injured, with a violent storm descending upon them. The howling of the wind began to sound like a mournful cry, mocking their desperate hope. Gideon looked from the helpless child to the darkening sky, and then to the small, trembling horse beside him. The horse that had led him here, against all odds. The horse that was now their only, impossible chance. The wilderness had revealed its prize, only to snap the jaws of the trap shut around them. The first crack of thunder was not a distant rumble, but a sharp, violent explosion that seemed to split the sky directly overhead. It was the starting gun for a race they were already losing. The bruised clouds on the horizon had boiled up with astonishing speed, swallowing the blue sky and casting the canyon in a sickly gray light. The wind, no longer a sigh, began to whip and moan, tearing at Gideon's clothes and stinging his eyes with dust. Raindrops, fat and cold, began to fall, not as a shower but as scattered, heavy splats against the dry rock, each one leaving a dark circle that quickly expanded and merged with the next. Down in the ravine, Sadie let out a small cry of fear as the thunder echoed off the narrow walls. She tried to pull herself further under a small overhang, her movement hampered by her injured leg. Gideon's heart twisted. Every minute they wasted, the storm worsened, and the ravine became more dangerous. The loose dirt on the walls would turn to slick, treacherous mud. The floor of the ravine would become a channel for the flash flood that was sure to follow. "It's all right, Sadie," Gideon yelled, his words nearly snatched away by the wind. "Just stay put." He paced the edge of the ravine like a caged animal, his mind a whirlwind of frantic, useless plans. He had a rope on his saddle, but it wasn't long enough. He couldn't climb down and carry her up. The rock was too crumbly, too sheer. A single misstep would kill them both. Leaving her to get help was a death sentence. The storm would be on them in full force long before he could return with the others, if he could even find them in the deluge. He was trapped by his own powerlessness, the vast, indifferent wilderness mocking his efforts. Then, from the growing gloom, came a new sound. It was long and low, a mournful note that cut through the whistle of the wind, a wolf's howl. It was distant, but unmistakable. And then it was answered by another, closer this time. Gideon's blood ran cold. The scent of Sadie's injury, the blood from whatever cuts she'd sustained in the fall, would be a beacon in this barren landscape, a pack drawn by the promise of an easy meal. The storm was no longer their only enemy. He looked at Ember. The little mare stood her ground, unmoved by the thunder that made even Gideon flinch. The rain was plastering her chestnut coat to her skin, running in rivulets down her face. She was trembling, a constant, violent shiver now, but her eyes were still locked on the child below. And in that moment, Gideon understood what the horse already knew. He had been thinking like a man, considering the limits of a man. But he hadn't considered the unique capabilities of the creature beside him. Ember was small, light-footed, with the uncanny balance of a mountain goat. The steep, narrow game trails that crisscrossed these canyons were her natural habitat. A path that was impossible for a human or a larger horse might just be possible for her. It was insane, a suicidal gamble, but it was the only gamble they had left. He looked at Ember, meeting her wide, intelligent eyes. He saw the fear there, the deep primal terror that was her constant companion. But he saw something else too, burning brighter than the fear, that inexplicable, fierce instinct that had brought them here, a protective urge that was overriding every impulse for self-preservation. Ember seemed to make the decision before he did. She took a step closer to the edge, her head lowering as she assessed the descent. She snorted, a sharp exhalation of breath, and pawed at the rocky ground, dislodging a small cascade of pebbles that skittered down into the ravine. She was not looking at him for guidance. She was looking at the path. She knew. In that moment, a profound and terrible choice hung in the air, to trust her, to let her go. Gideon's mind reeled, but as another howl, closer now, echoed from the rocks, he knew there was no other way. The wolves were closing in, the storm was breaking, and the child was trapped. Ember made her choice. With a resolve that seemed to come from some deep, untapped wellspring within her, she turned and took a few steps back from the edge. Then, she pivoted, facing the ravine wall, and began to descend. It was not a fall or a slide, but a controlled, terrifying act of will. She moved like no horse Gideon had ever seen, angling her body, her hooves finding impossibly small footholds in the crumbling rock face. She moved backward, crab-like, her powerful haunches bearing the brunt of the strain as she lowered herself step by agonizing step. Loose rock and dirt cascaded around her, but she moved with a focused grace, a dancer on the edge of a blade. Gideon could only watch, his breath caught in his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The rain was coming down in earnest now, a cold, driving sheet that slicked the rocks and turned the dirt to greasy mud. Each step Ember took was a small miracle of balance and strength. He could hear her grunting with the effort, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Down she went, into the growing darkness of the ravine, a small, brave shadow against the unforgiving stone. She reached the bottom and stumbled, her legs shaking from the strain, but she did not fall. She immediately turned and walked to Sadie, her movements gentle. She nudged the child's hand with her soft nose. Sadie, who had been watching the descent with wide, terrified eyes, reached out a trembling hand and laid it on the mare's wet neck. In the heart of the raging storm, surrounded by the growing threat of predators, a silent, profound connection was forged between the terrified child and the trembling horse. Gideon could hear the wolves now, not just their howls, but the sound of their paws on the rock, the click of their claws. They were near the top of the ravine, on the opposite side, their shadowy forms moving between the rocks. They were patient, waiting. "Sadie!" Gideon roared over the storm. "You have to get on her back. Climb on!" The little girl looked up, her face a pale oval in the gloom. Then she looked at Ember. The horse stood perfectly still, bracing herself against the wind, offering her back. This was the moment of ultimate trust, the breaking point. Slowly, painfully, Sadie began to move. She whimpered as she put weight on her good leg, using a rocky outcrop to pull herself up. Ember flinched as the small, unfamiliar weight settled onto her back, her skin twitching, her old fears surging. But she held. She stood like a statue of living stone as the small, hurt child wrapped her arms around her neck and clung to her, burying her wet, cold face in her mane. And now, the ascent. The impossible climb. The howling was no longer distant. It was a tangible presence, a chorus of hunger just beyond the lip of the ravine. The wolves were there, silhouettes pacing the edge, their eyes glinting in the flashes of lightning that now tore the sky apart. Ember could smell them, a rank predatory scent that flooded her senses and screamed at every nerve to bolt, to flee. The rain was a solid wall of water, sluicing down the ravine walls, turning the precarious path into a muddy waterfall. Below, the floor of the ravine was already beginning to collect water, a dark, swirling current tugging at her hooves. There was no way back, only up, into the teeth of the storm and the jaws of the pack. With Sadie clinging to her back, a small, precious weight of trust and terror, Ember turned to face the cliff. This was it. The culmination of all her fear, all her instinct, all her hidden, unknown strength. She planted her front hooves on the first ledge. The rock was slick as glass, her muscles bunched, quivering with a strain that was beyond anything she had ever known. The trembling that had defined her life, the shaking of fear, was now transformed. It was the vibration of a finely tuned engine pushed to its absolute limit, a tremor of pure, focused exertion. One step. Her hoof slipped, sending a shower of mud and rock into the churning water below. Sadie cried out, a small, sharp sound of fear, and tightened her grip. Ember grunted, found a better purchase, and pulled. Her whole body was a knot of straining muscle. The wind tore at them, trying to peel them from the rock face. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in a series of stark, terrifying tableaus. The desperate horse, the clinging child, the watching wolves. Another step. Her powerful hind legs propelled them upward. She was climbing now, not with the panicked scrabble of a cornered animal, but with a grim, rhythmic determination. Each foothold was a battle won. She used her nose, her shoulders, her entire body to brace herself against the wall, her breath coming in great, heaving gasps that fogged in the cold air. The pain in her lungs was a fire, the strain in her legs an agony, but the small, warm weight on her back, the trusting arms wrapped around her neck, were an anchor. It was a feeling she had never known, not of being ridden, but of being needed. It was a purpose that burned hotter than her pain and brighter than her fear. Gideon watched from above, helpless, a silent witness to the heroic terror unfolding below. He held the rope from his saddle, a useless talisman in his hand. He could do nothing but watch her fight, watch this small, rejected horse wage war against the wilderness itself. He saw the gleam of wolf eyes across the chasm, and his hand went to the pistol at his hip, but they were too far, the wind and rain too wild for a clear shot. All he could do was pray to a god he wasn't sure he believed in. Higher she climbed. 10 feet, 20, 30. She was a third of the way up, then halfway. The howling of the wolves grew more frantic, a frustrated, hungry sound. They could see their prey escaping. One of the larger wolves, bolder than the rest, began to pick its way down the opposite side of the ravine, its movements slick and confident. It was trying to cut them off. Ember saw the movement. She saw the predator. A wave of pure, white-hot terror threatened to overwhelm her. Her legs trembled violently, and for a heart-stopping moment she froze, her body plastered to the rock. This was the fear she knew, the fear that had always owned her. But then she felt the small shiver from the child on her back, heard the tiny, muffled sob against her neck. And the bond, forged in that dark, wet place, was stronger than the fear. The instinct to protect, to deliver her precious cargo to safety, was absolute. She let out a defiant, whistling cry, a sound that was half scream, half snort, and lunged upward, finding a new surge of strength from the depths of her terror. She scrambled over a particularly nasty ledge, her hooves scrabbling for purchase on the slick mud. For a horrifying second, her back legs slid, and they dangled, suspended over the churning water below. Sadie screamed. But Ember's front hooves held. With a monumental effort that tore a guttural groan from her chest, she hauled them up, her body scraping against the rock. She was bleeding, her hide torn and scraped in a dozen places, but she did not stop. The top was so close now, just a few more feet. She could see Gideon's face, pale and taut, his hand outstretched as if he could somehow pull them up through sheer will. The bold wolf was getting closer, moving with terrifying speed on the other side. The howling was a deafening, constant wall of sound. With one final, desperate surge, Ember powered over the lip of the ravine. She stumbled onto solid ground, her legs giving way beneath her. She collapsed onto the muddy earth, not with a crash, but with a controlled folding of her exhausted body, ensuring Sadie could slide safely to the ground. She lay there, her sides heaving, her body a trembling, bleeding, mud-caked mess. Her breath was a ragged saw in the roaring wind. She had done it. She had performed the impossible. Gideon was there in an instant, pulling Sadie away from the edge, wrapping her in his arms. He fired a shot from his pistol into the air, a booming crack that momentarily silenced the wolves and sent them scattering back from the edge. He looked down at Ember, who had struggled to lift her head, her wide, dark eyes finding his. There was no fear in them now, only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. He dropped to his knees beside her, ignoring the mud and the rain, and laid a hand on her neck. Her skin was hot, her pulse a frantic, thudding rhythm beneath his palm. "You did it, girl," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You did it." She had climbed out of the grave, carrying hope on her back, and emerged into the storm, triumphant and shattered. The howling of the wolves faded into the fury of the wind, their menace defeated. There, on the edge of the world, in the heart of the storm, the horse nobody wanted had become a hero. The journey back was a long, slow procession of exhaustion and relief. The storm, having spent its fury, broke as dawn approached, its angry gray clouds giving way to a bruised purple and then a soft, pearlescent pink. The world was washed clean, the air sharp and cool, smelling of wet sage and damp earth. Gideon walked, leading Ember, who limped on a foreleg but moved with a steady, newfound calm. Sadie, wrapped in Gideon's oversized coat, was perched on Thunder's broad, reliable back. The big gelding had been left tied in a sheltered cove of rock, and he had carried the child with the placid ease for which he was known. But the respect in Gideon's eyes was reserved for the small, battered mare walking quietly at his side. They emerged from the mouth of the canyon just as the first rays of sun crested the mesas, painting the wet landscape in hues of gold and rose. In the distance, they could see the Ward homestead, a light already burning in the window, a beacon of weary hope. As they drew closer, a figure appeared on the porch. It was Tobias Ward. He had ridden all night, a hollow-eyed specter of grief and fear, returning with no news. He stopped, frozen, as he saw the small approaching party. He saw Thunder, the big, dependable horse, and then he saw the small, frail figure on his back. "Sadie?" His voice was a choked whisper. He started to run, stumbling over the muddy ground, his face a mess of disbelief and dawning joy. Clara burst from the door behind him, her face etched with the agony of a sleepless night. Her cry when she saw her daughter was a sound that seemed to pull the very soul from her body. The reunion was a maelstrom of tears and frantic, relieved touches. Clara and Tobias enveloped their daughter, their hands running over her, checking for injuries, murmuring her name over and over again as if it were a prayer. Sadie, exhausted but safe, clung to them, her small body finally surrendering to the safety of her parents' arms. For a long moment, the world consisted only of that desperate, loving circle. The rest of the search party, drawn by the commotion, began to arrive in twos and threes. They stopped their horses, their tired, grim faces transforming first to shock and then to awe as the story unfolded. They looked at Sadie, alive and whole save for a broken leg and a collection of scrapes. They looked at Gideon, his weathered face streaked with mud and relief. And then they looked at Ember. She stood quietly to one side, her head low, her body a testament to the night's ordeal. Her coat was matted with mud and blood, long, angry scrapes marking her flanks and legs. She was still trembling, a fine shiver of exhaustion and shock that ran through her battered frame. But she stood with a stillness they had never seen in her before. The spooky, unwanted mare was gone. In her place was a creature of quiet, undeniable dignity. Tobias Ward, his eyes still wet with tears, finally turned his attention from his daughter. He walked over to Gideon, his hand outstretched. "Gideon, I don't have words. How did you find her?" Gideon didn't look at him. His gaze was on Ember. "I didn't find her," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the morning air. "She did." He recounted the story in clipped, simple terms, how Ember had led him there, against all logic, how she had descended into the ravine, how she had climbed out, through the storm, with Sadie on her back. A profound silence fell over the gathered ranchers. They looked at the treacherous maze of canyons they had just spent the night searching, then back at the small horse. They looked at her size, her delicate frame, and tried to reconcile it with the impossible feat Gideon had described. The dismissal and pity with which they had always viewed her was replaced by a deep, humbling respect. They were horsemen, all of them. They knew what a horse could and could not do, and they knew they were looking at a miracle. Tobias walked over to Ember, his movements slow and reverent. He reached out a hand, not to appraise, but to thank. He laid his palm gently on her cheek. Ember, who would have once flinched from such a touch, stood perfectly still. She met his gaze with her soft, dark eyes. I owe you her life," Tobias said, his voice thick. "Name your price, Gideon. Whatever it is, I'll pay it. She belongs with Sadie." The other men murmured in agreement. It was the ultimate prize for a horse, a loving home, a life of ease and adoration. It was what Ember had been waiting for her entire life, to be chosen, to be wanted. Gideon looked at Ember. He saw the scars, the exhaustion, the quiet strength. He remembered winning her in that poker game, seeing her as nothing more than a bad bet. He remembered his own skepticism as he'd followed her into the canyon, and he remembered the surge of pride and awe as he watched her climb from that ravine, a warrior queen emerging from the underworld. He had taken a chance on her, a sliver of intuition. She had repaid him with a soul. He shook his head slowly. "She's not for sale." The words hung in the clean morning air. Tobias looked at him, confused. "Gideon, I don't think you understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Gideon interrupted, his voice firm. He walked over and stood by Ember's head, placing a proprietary hand on her neck. "This one? She's earned her home. With me." He looked at the horse, and a rare small smile touched the corner of his mouth. "The thing you search your whole life for, trust, a place to belong. You don't sell it once you find it. It's not given. It's built. One splinter and scar at a time." His words were a quiet declaration. This was not about money or ownership. It was about respect. It was about redemption. For both of them, he was giving her the one thing she had never had, a permanent home, a place of belonging not offered out of pity, but earned through an act of selfless, impossible bravery. The story ends not with a grand celebration, but in the quiet that follows. Days later, Ember stands in a lush green pasture behind the trading post, a space she'd never been allowed into before. Her wounds are clean and healing, leaving behind thin, pale scars that map her courage. The deep, ingrained fear is gone, replaced by a profound and settled peace. The trembling has stopped. Sadie, her legs set in a bright white cast, sits on a small wooden stool just inside the fence, reading a book aloud. Her voice is a soft, melodic drone, a comforting sound in the afternoon warmth. Every few minutes, Ember lifts her head from the sweet grass and ambles over. She rests her head on the top rail of the fence, and Sadie puts down her book to stroke the mare's soft nose, her fingers gently tracing the new scar along her cheek. There are no words between them, only a shared understanding that transcends species. It is a bond forged in darkness and terror, cemented by a trust that asked for everything and received it. Ember is no longer the invisible horse, the unwanted soul. She is Ember, the brave, the beloved. She has found her herd, a small, quiet herd of two. She closes her eyes, soaking in the warmth of the sun and the gentle touch of the girl she saved. Here, in the hard-earned peace, surrounded by the quiet hum of a world that finally saw her true worth, she was home, vindicated, whole,